Welcome back to another edition of Family Vacation. I'm your host, AJ Tenari. Last week, Matt took the reins and gave us an extremely vivid and well thought out review of one of his favorite 2023 albums, Why Does the Earth Give Us People to Love by Cara Jackson. If you guys haven't checked it out yet, I highly recommend doing so. You will not regret it. But I'm back for this week, and you know what? I realized something. We've had a lot of fun praising some of our favorite releases of this year, talking about all the musicality, production, and lyrics that have been amazingly executed by some very talented artists all throughout 2023. And honestly, I'm over it. This week, family heads, we're getting negative. I'm going to dive into an album that's had me scratching my head since I listened to it all the way back in June. So sit back and buckle up, because right now, we're going to take a little ad break. So, be back soon.
Hey Matt, you know what I love?
Steely Dan?
Well, yes, but I also love how easy it is for two goobers like us to make a podcast.
I mean, with Spotify for Podcasters, it's no wonder. Spotify for Podcasters is a one-stop shop that's got everything you need to create the perfect podcast.
That's right. Using Spotify for Podcasters, you can directly record and edit your podcast wherever you are, using their intuitive and easy-to-use website.
And once you're done editing, Spotify for Podcasters takes care of the hard part and distributes your podcast directly to Spotify and everywhere else podcasts are available.
And now you can even make video podcasts available on Spotify, which gives you even more freedom to make the podcast you want, while also giving your lovely listeners a chance to see your face.
Speaking of listeners, Spotify for Podcasters also encourages fan engagement by letting you get feedback directly from your listeners with Q&As and polls made by you.
You can even make money with your podcast through ads, podcast subscriptions, and donations directly from your audience.
Spotify for Podcasters offers all of this, and it's completely free to use with no catch whatsoever.
Guys, Spotify for Podcasters made recording and distributing the family album so easy. Being able to schedule our episodes ahead of time and letting them take care of distribution took so much weight off our shoulders.
For anyone that's ever even thought about starting a podcast, we highly recommend giving Spotify for Podcasters a try.
You can download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters to get started.
Once again, download the Spotify for Podcasters app or go to www.spotify.com/podcasters.
Never gets old, does it? Anyway, on to the album of this week. Today, I'll be discussing Avenged Sevenfold's newest LP, Life Is But a Dream. Life Is But a Dream was released June 2nd, 2023 on Warner Records, and it is the first studio release of the group in almost 6 years. Iconic heavy metal band Avenged Sevenfold have strayed away from their traditional metal sound, instead opting to take on a more ambitious experimental approach to their new record. And unfortunately, I have to say, I do not think it works very well. Let me just preface this, I am not an Avenged fan by any means. Now, I don't dislike them, but until this album, I have never actively listened to any of their discography. So I have no frame of reference for how this album stacks up against their previous work, and for now, I'm just judging this project solely as its own thing. And unfortunately, I really don't think it stands on its own. Starting off with one of, if not the biggest flaw of this album, M. Shadow's vocals. My god, this man's voice is completely shot. And anytime he goes for a high note, you just tense up waiting to hear it stall and give out. Which is a shame, because there are genuinely good musical moments that are completely ruined by Shadow's wheezing over top of them, as if he's singing from an iron lung. Take the vocals on lead single Nobody. Shadow's almost exclusively yells and uses his high register throughout this track, and you can literally hear his vocal cords trembling, holding on for dear life as if they're about to snap entirely. Now, Shadows is only in his 40s, but he sounds like he just got the band out of retirement for a farewell tour all across this album. Even when Shadows is not trying to shatter his vocal cords, his lower register leaves a lot to be desired. Oftentimes sounding like a discount Mike Patton when he's quieter on tracks like We Love You, or Saint Anger era James Hetfield when he does whatever the fuck on album opener Game Over. I don't know if something happened to him between Avenged's last album and now, but the vocals are insanely distracting and often take away from would-be album highlights due to their poor quality. Speaking of poor quality, let's discuss the production. Now, I don't have too many gripes with how this album sounds. I honestly think it sounds fine. My personal issues come with their creative ideas. I'll give credit to Avenged where it's due. I really do respect the ambition they had for this album. Tracks constantly shift genres, creating tonally different passages that lead to very interesting sonic experiments, and I greatly appreciate the prog influence that's all over this album. That being said, most of the time, none of these ideas or genre shifts ever mix well. This album is constantly at odds with itself, never agreeing on a consistent sound and bashing together ideas that do not mesh. One of the more infamous examples being the chorus of the second track, Mattel. Mattel begins as your standard butt metal track with what sounds like Shadow singing into a fan, but during the chorus oddly slows to a ballad, with Shadows croaking out the notorious Plastic Daisies line, only being backed by synths from a jazz fusion song. The Plastic Daisies line has been memed to hell, and it's very easy to see why. It's incredibly cringy lyrically, and the delivery of the vocals is honestly kind of embarrassing. While we're on Mattel, I should mention that the rest of the song suffers from these strange style shifts, not just the chorus. After another cycle of butt metal ballads, we get a metalcore breakdown that transitions into an 80s glam metal solo, with keys that would make even the lords of synth weep. Finally, the song ends with a reprise of the chorus that has the exaggerated theatricality of a Tally Hall track. As you can see, a lot happens in this one track, but it never really fits together. It just transitions from one section to the next, never expanding on ideas and just having them there for the sake of having them. I guess one could argue that the Plastic Daisies line itself kind of expands by the end, as during its last appearance it's now backed by a full band, but I don't think that's enough. For the most part, these sections just happen for seemingly no other reason than the band thought they sounded cool. Other examples of odd production choices include the refrain of We Love You, feeling extremely try-hard and society-core with the lower-pitched vocals shouting more, power, more, pace. There's also the sporadic spliced-together vocals on the verses of Game Over, which sound extremely disjointed and like a rejected track off of Saint Anger. Now, this might have a defense thematically, as the song is about someone's life flashing before their eyes as they're committing suicide, so these lyrics are there to represent the rapid nature in which this is happening, but from a purely listening standpoint, it's extremely distracting and sounds almost amateur in its editing. Death sees the group going for an almost Frank Sinatra style, with M Shadows crooning over a surprisingly well-arranged orchestra and horn section. And a final infamous example is the entirety of the track Ordinary being pretty derivative of Daft Punk's Get Lucky. Now this is typically a genre of music that I like, but on an Avenged Sevenfold record, it just feels off. The deep groovy bass lines, the wah-wah funk guitars, and Shadow's auto-tune vocals just do not mesh with any other track that precede or follow this one. Even on an album that is constantly switching styles, this track specifically feels out of place. I've heard this album be referred to as We Have Mr. Bungle at Home, and I can definitely see why. Avenged kind of emulates the constant genre and style shifts of Mr. Bungle, but doesn't quite yet have the skill to pull them off as effectively. The shifts on Mr. Bungle albums are impressively seamless and complement each other very well. They allow tracks to constantly shift and evolve previously established ideas, making them feel like complete movements by the time they're over. On Life is But a Dream, however, the shifts feel half-baked, as if the band was just throwing ideas at the wall to see what stuck, and most of the time, nothing really sticks. Let me say again, I really do respect the ambition the band put into this project. Avenged has been criticized for being derivative in the past, especially for their work on albums like Hail to the King. So seeing the band get so experimental and just try literally every idea they could think of is very admirable. And it does sound like they had a lot of fun recording this album, so I don't want to take that away from them. But unfortunately, ideas can only take you so far. The poor execution of this album takes away from the interesting ideas they had, and ultimately leads to the project suffering creatively. However, there are bright spots on this album, all of which come from the musicality. The musicianship on this album single-handedly saves it from being a complete mess. Starting off, Brooks Wackerman's drum work is an easy highlight all throughout this album. He remains consistently tight on every track no matter what he's playing. Whether it be the fast-paced blast beats on the synth solo in Mattel, the syncopated 16th note accents and fills during the outro of Cosmic, or the 6/8 shuffle beat during the halftime on G, the variety and versatility displayed by Wackerman is genuinely impressive and goes to show that this group really has musical chops. But that's not all. Any instance of prog-influenced acoustic guitar is greatly appreciated and usually always fits tonally on any given track. Specific shoutouts go to the Spanish-influenced strumming on the intro of Game Over with that Fear Elise interpolation, as well as the solo of We Love You sounding simultaneously dark and epic, like something off of a Led Zeppelin album. There's also the backup vocalists on the track G, Brianna Mazzola and Tara Stinson. They add an actually interesting change of pace that helps the album remain fresh 8 tracks deep. I also love the tone of the guitar during the refrain of this track. It sounds like something out of a twerp song and I'm all here for it. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the piano work on this album. The piano-led outro of Beautiful Morning adds flavor to an otherwise mostly forgettable song. And of course, I also gotta mention the purely instrumental piano solo that is the closer, the title track. My god, Sinister Gates' piano work is simply incredible and creates this dreadfully delightful feeling of melancholy and finality. It'll definitely stick with you long after this album's over. Gang, I feel like I've rambled long enough, so let's just get to my final thoughts and ratings. Overall, Life is But a Dream is definitely all over the place. It's a very confused album that tries literally everything it can to be different and experimental, but ultimately falls flat due to a clear lack of focus. Creatively, ideas mesh about as well as current M shadows and a microphone, resulting in a bloated experience with sections within songs that clash artistically and detract from the overall listening experience. But that isn't to say that this album is all bad. The musicianship remains consistently great all across the board, and there are even some standout tracks that I would consider great all the way through, those being the aforementioned Cosmic and the title track. So even though Life is But a Dream is a mess, it's a fun mess. Like I said, you can just hear how much fun the band had recording this project, and I hope that they learn from their mistakes on this album so that someday they can make something that's actually worth dreaming about. With all that being said, I think I'll be giving Life is But a Dream by Avenged Sevenfold a 5.6 out of 10 and a solid C-. And there we have another episode of Family Vacation Down. What did you guys think? I thought it was fun doing something on the more negative side for a change. Definitely a cool little change of pace. Also, apologies if my voice sounded kind of weird this episode. I've been sick this past week and I lost my voice, so I'm still recovering from that. But speaking of which, I just want to give a shout out to something that's very near and dear to my heart, and that's wonton soup. That stuff is an actual miracle cure, and it's been keeping me alive this past week. Like, wonton soup makes chicken noodle soup look like it's bitch. Like, I'm fairly convinced at this point with one gulp, wonton soup could bring a man back from the dead. Seriously, if you inject the plague rat with wonton soup, that fucker will turn into Stuart Little. I'm telling you, family heads. Wonton soup next time you're sick, just remember. But anyways, as always, I'm your host, AJ Tenari. Be sure to let me know what you thought about this week's episode, as well as Life is But a Dream. Thank you for always listening, and I'll see you next week.